Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Aaron Tobin, and I am very proud to be the current president of the Dallas Bar Association. On behalf of our 11,000 plus members of the DBA, I want to welcome you to the first installment of our programming surrounding the 20th anniversary of September 11th. We're thrilled to have Phil Zelikow, the executive director of the 9/11 Commission, here to talk to you and reflect on his dealings with September 11th and thereafter. Now, while we are very much looking forward to today's program, I would like to remind everyone that our second installment featuring DBA past presidents Harriet Myers and Bob Jordan will be a hybrid event at noon on September 10th at the Arts District Mansion. You will have the opportunity to attend in person or virtually if you would like to. I'm sure most of you remember that Ms. Myers was White House Secretary and later Chief White House Counsel in the Bush administration. She was actually with the president when he received the news of the attack. Ambassador Jordan served as an ambassador to Saudi Arabia in the Bush administration. So it'll be very interesting to get his thoughts during that programming. We're very fortunate that Doug Dunbar of Channel 11 has agreed to moderate the program. So we look forward to seeing everybody on September 10th. Now today, this program is being co-sponsored by the Dallas Bar Association's Public Forum Committee, as well as the World Affairs Council of DFW. And we are very fortunate to have with us today the president and CEO of the World Affairs Council of DFW, Liz Brailsford, who I will now turn it over to for a few remarks. Liz?
Thanks, Aaron. It's always such a pleasure to partner with the Dallas Bar Association, and I'm especially proud to be working together on several programs that focus on 9/11. As we approach the 20th anniversary of the attacks, and with the latest developments out of Afghanistan, we at the World Affairs Council have been giving great thought to the legacy, victories, and hardships of the last 2 decades. I know our audience has much to gain from today's conversation, and I'd like to thank Phil Zelikow and our moderator, David Kent, and his firm, Faegre Drinker, for joining us today. This fall, the World Affairs Council will continue to offer a few virtual programs, and we're excited to also be opening back up for in-person events. And on that note, in recent weeks, we've had many discussions on COVID and safety protocols, and we'll be taking every step in our capacity to protect our community as we move forward. For the most up-to-date information on our health and safety practices and to view our complete event lineup, visit dfwworld.org. I'd like to highlight one of our upcoming programs, which will take place in person at 6 p.m. on Thursday, September 16th at the Crescent Hotel, featuring Ben Rhodes, former Deputy National Security Advisor to President Obama, and now co-host of Pod Save the World, for a discussion on his new book, After the Fall, Being American in the World We've Made, which reflects on America's role in shaping many of the defining moments of the modern era. I hope you'll join us then. And we're also really happy for the September 10th program that Aaron just mentioned and are looking forward to that. And now I'll pass it back to Aaron, and thanks again.
Thank you, Liz. We very much appreciate your partnership in this important programming. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce the moderator of today's program and my dear friend, David Kent. David is a partner with Faegre Drinker, where he practices civil trial law. He is a graduate of Baylor Law School as well as Baylor Undergraduate School. He is board certified in civil trial and personal injury law and has been a super lawyer for the past 15 years. He has been a loyal bar servant for many years. He has served on the board of directors for the State Bar of Texas, served on the board for the Dallas Bar Association, as well as the board of trustees for the Dallas Bar Foundation. He has chaired or co-chaired over 10 different Dallas Bar Association committees, including at one time this committee, the Public Forum Committee. Somehow he manages to do all of this and still sport a 12 handicap in his golf game. So with that, David, it's my pleasure to turn it over to you to introduce our featured speaker today, as well as begin the program.
Thank you very much, President Tobin, and thank you, President Brailsford. The Dallas-Fort Worth chapter of the World Affairs Council does a remarkable job of programming throughout the year. and I encourage people to take advantage of that programming whenever possible. When we were planning this particular program months ago, little did we know that it would coincide with the events of the past week or so, with the withdrawal of the U.S. troops in Afghanistan and the declaration by President Biden that the war was officially over. It could not make things more timely than now for us to look back at what happened 20 years ago, the investigations that occurred at that time, the lessons learned from that time, and how they resonate with us today. To that end, we are very fortunate to have with us Phil Zelikow, Dr. Philip Zelikow, who was the executive director of the commission. The official title was the National Commission on Terrorist Attacks upon the United States, but it is commonly known as the 9/11 Commission. Dr. Zelikow's day job, as it were, is serving as the White Burkett Miller Professor of History in the Corcoran Department of History at the University of Virginia, where he has taught for more than 20 years. Prior to that, he spent 7 years at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. And before that, he worked in the Department of State as a Foreign Service officer for several years. Interspersed with all of that time was service spent with the United States government, as we'll talk about in a moment. But do not let those many years of life on the East Coast or abroad fool you. As Dr. Zelikow was quick to tell me, he is a Texan at heart and by birthright. He grew up in Houston. He went to the University of Houston for the first 3 years of college before transferring to Redlands University in California for his senior year, where he graduated. But he quickly came back to the University of Houston School of Law, where he got his JD. He clerked for the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, and he spent about 5 years working as a trial and appellate lawyer. So he brings to all of this story today the experience not only in academia, not only in government service, but also as a lawyer by training and by profession. As I said, after about 5 years of service as a lawyer, he succumbed to the siren call of life in academia and in the area of foreign policy. And he decided to go back. He applied to and went to school at the Fletcher School of Diplomacy at Tufts University, where he got both his master's and his PhD. He joined the Foreign Service Foreign Service Office ranks at the Department of State, and quickly rose through those ranks, serving some time in the Secretariat for Secretary of State George Shultz in the Reagan administration. In Bush 41's administration, he worked with National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft. After that, he went back to Harvard, or he went to Harvard, but that did not stop him because he came back once more to work in government, and he's worked in a variety of positions there. He served on Bush 43's Presidential Intelligence Advisory Board for 2 years. He then was also counselor to the Department of State, working directly with Condoleezza Rice for 2 years in 2005 to 2007. And he also worked for President Obama on the Intelligence Advisory Board for 2 years, which is something of a rarity to work on both Republican and defense administrations. And he worked for the defense, or was appointed to the Defense Policy Board from 2015 to 2017. In addition to all of that, and to his classroom schedules, he is widely published. He's published many books of history, ranging from analysis of the Cuban Missile Crisis to the Suez Canal Crisis, the reunification of Germany, and most recently on World War I, a book that has been very well reviewed and received. Throughout these periods of governmental service, he has done more than just sit in Washington. He has put his boots on the ground. He spent time in Afghanistan, Pakistan, the Middle East. So his knowledge base is far more than just academic. We welcome Dr. Zelikow and look forward to hearing from him today.
Thanks,
Now,
David.
Dr.
Good to see you
Zelikow,
again.
before you say anything, Dr. Zelikow, I think the first thing that any discussion like this has to turn to is, where were you on 9/11?
I was teaching at the University of Virginia and running a research center there called the Miller Center of Public Affairs. It was a beautiful Tuesday morning in Virginia, as it was across the whole eastern seaboard of the United States. And I arrived at my office. TV was on, people passed, because we were about to hold a public event. Television was on, heard the news about the initial attack and in New York. I had been working on terrorism issues in previous years, and so I made the connection pretty quickly to the possibility that this might be a terrorist attack, and all of my life certainly changed quite a lot thereafter. Now,
The commission was actually formed just a little more than a year later. It officially came into existence in November of 2002, right at Thanksgiving time, when President Bush signed a law that authorized the commission. And the commission's work lasted for about a year and a half. It was finished by the summer of 2004. But what were the things that brought you to the commission? Did you seek it out? Did they seek you out? How did the two come together?
So they sought me out. It's actually kind of an interesting story, David, mostly forgotten now. It all turns on who was leading the commission. So the original chair and vice chair of the commission were the initial appointees were Henry Kissinger to chair it, and former Senate Majority Leader George Mitchell as the vice chair. And they planned to hire their own executive director to run the thing as the CEO of the staff. But right away, they realized that they would have to disclose and divest themselves of all sorts of interests that might be seen as conflicting with their duties with the commission. And Kissinger immediately resigned the position, and George Mitchell promptly followed and also resigned. So the plan B for the chair and vice chair turned out to be extremely fortunate. President Bush turned to a former governor of New Jersey named Tom Kean, who incidentally had long earlier gotten a PhD in history at Princeton and had a bit of the sensibility of a historian. And then as the vice chair, the Democratic leaders in Congress picked former Congressman Lee Hamilton of Indiana. Hamilton was a deep Washington veteran, and Hamilton was thinking about who would be the executive director, and it was actually Hamilton, the Democrat, who came up with the idea of appointing me. He had heard some things about work I had done on a very difficult bipartisan commission to reform the American election system after the problems in Florida in the 2000 election. That commission had worked out very well during 2001 and 2002. And people involved in that effort had commended me to Hamilton. And Hamilton then reached out to me and called me more or less out of the blue and asked me if I would be interested. And I said I'd be glad to look at it. And then he arranged for me to go see Tom Kean. And Kean and I hit it off right away and always had a really good common understanding of what could be possible. This was extremely fortunate as well because Kean and Hamilton worked together in a way I think Kissinger and Mitchell never would have. It was fortuitous, is they decided right away that the commission was, in a way, it was very politically appointed, all sorts of partisan issues in the air. They decided that to overcome that, they would have to be joined at the hip. You could not see any daylight between Kean and Hamilton on anything. That they would always work in lockstep. And then in turn, they then projected that onto me as the executive director to hire a unitary, nonpartisan staff and take my orders directly from them, not from all the other commissioners who were appointed in a very political process. And but many of whom really then rose to the occasion and did an outstanding job. But I wanted to stress the unusual way the leadership came together, Kean and Hamilton's role, and then the fact that they recruited me and the oddity being that though I was associated at that time more with Republicans, it was Hamilton, the Democrat, who actually reached out and suggested me.
That's very interesting. In the introduction to the executive summary of the commission's report, it commented on the fact that the report was a unanimous report, signed and agreed to by everyone, and it came at a time of great partisan divide. Since we have only recently seen an example of that partisan divide in the attempts to form an investigatory body to look into the events of January 6th, just how partisan was it? You've said it was partisan. Just can you provide any comparison to what we've just recently experienced and seen?
Yes, it was a very partisan time, but as bad as it was, I think the recent period has been worse. This was also a commission about how to respond to a foreign terrorist attack on the United States, where foreign terrorists had tried to destroy the US Capitol. The January 6th events, of course, was a domestic terrorist attack, intimately related to and growing out of the presidential election that actually had involved people occupying the US Capitol for a time. So the January 6th circumstances, struck right to the heart of American domestic politics at the time, in an environment that, if anything, was more partisan than it was even back in 2003, 2004. So, and Congress failed to enact the January 6th Commission bill, as probably all of your listeners know, and which is unfortunate, and it'll now be investigated in another way. But Congress was barely able to come together to do this commission, in our case, the 9/11 Commission. By the way, President Bush hadn't wanted the commission, mainly because he and some of his aides, like Vice President Cheney, thought the commission would be a distraction from waging the ongoing war on terror, though it actually turned out to be an enormous asset in the long-term conduct of that war.
And we'll come to that. That's an
It's
interesting
interesting, David, just to add that a little bit.
Yeah.
The reason President Bush's opposition got overcome was partly pressure from the victims' families, but it was really a bipartisan coming together of members of Congress led by Republican Senator John McCain, working with people like Joe Lieberman, who then did things in Congress that essentially forced the White House to go along.
So when the commission began its operation, you had to create a staff out of nothing, create everything out of whole cloth. What type of staffing did you have? What type of investigation and enforcement investigatory powers did you have?
Congress gave us plenty of power. We had subpoena power. Subpoena power, as many listeners know, subpoena power is great in theory, but sometimes unwieldy to use in practice. And that was certainly the case for the 9/11 Commission. We did need to wield it in a few very specific cases where there were particularly tough safes we needed to crack, so to speak. But in general, we had, as a congressional commission, it's a felony to lie to or mislead a congressional commission, whether or not you put a witness under oath. So that has a certain salutary effect. The fact that we had access to the underlying documents also, and the witnesses knew that, also had a healthy effect on the conduct of our 1,200 interviews. We created a staff basically, as you said, out of nothing. It was a short-lived federal agency, created and then existing for about a year and a half, and then going out of existence. I was the CEO. We ended up with about 85 staffers in 3 different offices, 2 offices in Washington, D.C., and a 3rd office in New York City that concentrated primarily on the first responder issues and things associated with the morning of the attack itself in New York. We had all sorts of information access issues with the Bush administration. I think a lot of them not really emanating so much from President Bush himself, but from zealots in his administration who were working hard to protect what they regarded as the prerogatives of the presidency in letting others access information. For instance, like the presidential daily briefings the CIA had been giving to the president before 9/11. We ended up getting access to all of that information, but it was often a very difficult and contentious process.
So I've read estimates that you interviewed more than 1,200 people in 10 different countries. You obtained 2.5 million pages of documents that you reviewed. The commission issued an executive summary, a full final report, and supplemental reports on terrorist financing, travel, other matters. You conducted public hearings, about a dozen public hearings over the course of many days, many of which were televised. So it would seem that you had a very thorough and robust interview and research investigatory process. But what type of pushback, if any, did you get from various agencies?
Well, the toughest nut actually was the White House over access to White House documents, and in the case of the CIA documents for the president. We had some tough arguments too about access to the 9/11 detainees themselves who were in custody. We won all of our information access battles except that one. The CIA and the president absolutely would not let us go personally and interview Khalid Sheikh Mohammed at black sites that at that time they had not yet revealed, frankly, to almost anybody in the US government. The locations and nature of those sites were at that time one among the most tightly held secrets in the United States. I mean, literally, there were like, outside of CIA, there could have been like 10 people in the whole US government who had relevant information about that. I would later in another job get much more involved in trying to, frankly, close down those programs. But at that time, getting access to those people was very hard. We were going to force the issue with subpoenas. Finally, an accommodation was worked out with the White House in which we would relay questions that would be asked to those prisoners, get back answers that they gave, and then we could ask follow-up questions. We already suspected, though we didn't then know the details, that there was some kind of extraordinary interrogation program underway. As I say, no one in the country knew the details of that program in 2003 and 2004. I would later find out all about that and get very involved in that from the inside, but then we didn't know. So we had this very difficult negotiation. It worked out reasonably well. We knew enough to realize that the information we were getting back through that process was not entirely trustworthy for various reasons. So we were always constantly trying to cross-check accounts that different people would give us against other information or other evidence that we had about the plot. And by the way, we cited all of our sources in the commission report so that readers can also evaluate for themselves what the sources were and so on. And there are some cases where we think detainees were saying things that, and as we said in the report, that we did not believe were true. Where we doubted their credibility, we said so. In cases where we thought that they were being reasonably accurate, we made it clear we thought we could believe that. In general, what happened was the prisoners mostly, we believe, told the truth about stuff that had happened in the past, and were actually not very forthcoming about things that might provide valuable intelligence in the present. I think this was the way they managed their interrogators.
Very interestingly, Chairman Tom Keene and Vice Chair Lee Hamilton wrote a book a couple of years after the release of the commission's report, in which they claimed the commission was set up to fail, and that the commission was so frustrated with repeated misrepresentations by officials from the Pentagon and the FAA that the commission actually considered opening another investigation into possible obstruction of justice by people within those agencies. Did you have that sense at the time?
Yes, we did. And I was actually the person who drafted the referral to the Department of Justice about those issues in 2004, along with a leader of the relevant staff team, a man named John Farmer, who is so angry about these issues, he vented that anger in a whole book that's significantly about this called The Ground Truth. Good book, by the way. Here's what happened. The setup to fail point has to do with the highly political character of the commission and the notion that the Republicans and Democrats would go at each other and it wouldn't be able to make much progress and would break down along partisan lines. They therefore did all the work I mentioned earlier to try to be sure that did not happen. And along with their tremendous efforts, that was also a burden that I had, is to try to make sure that we didn't split up that way, that we managed our staff as a unitary, nonpartisan staff. Now, the other issue that you mentioned having to do with the troubles with the FAA and the Pentagon actually have to do with what happened on the morning of 9/11. For reasons that inspector generals later concluded were merely gross negligence and not worse. Both the United States Air Force, specifically the NORAD inside the Air Force, and the FAA had issued quite sloppy and misleading timelines of what had actually happened on the morning of 9/11. These timelines were then spawning all sorts of conspiracy theories because they were so poorly put together. The effect of the timelines was to make agencies look like they knew more than they had known and had behaved more competently and purposefully than in fact they had behaved. The commission basically realized that the fundamental information about what had happened on the morning, the information, by the way, that had been given to the president and to the American people, was wrong in these details. And so we simply had to start from scratch, listen ourselves to all the material, all the recorded material in the FAA command centers, air traffic control centers, match them up with radar tracks, all sorts of data, crunch that, and come up with our own timeline of exactly what had happened, often down to the second, where all the aircraft were. And basically the effect of the story was to make it look like, frankly, people had been confused and clueless in the morning because they were facing something for which they were completely unprepared, which was true. And then we presented that, and then we held public hearings in which the leaders of those agencies were asked under oath, having examined now the work we had done, whether or not our work was correct, and they had to then concede under oath that their previous accounts were mistaken and these accounts were correct. And so then the issue became, well, why did they screw up the early accounts? And as I say, there was a spectrum of explanations that ranged from gross negligence to sort of misconduct in order to basically make people look better than they had been. And we assembled that evidence and did the referral to the Justice Department, which turned the problem over to the Inspector Generals of the Department of Transportation and the Department of Defense, who then later issued reports finding that the problem was only one of negligence.
Now, you mentioned the public hearings. I, for one, watched many of those hearings that were televised. And the question that I always had, and I have on many of those types of televised governmental hearings, is how much of that was scripted? How much was political theater? How much, if any, was a surprise where you actually learned something that you did not expect or know ahead of time?
The hearings had two parts. The first part was scripted, which was we would introduce the hearing on a topic with a staff statement that I would lead in presenting that summarized, here's what we've learned about this topic so far. Here are our interim discoveries, to help lay kind of a factual foundation and context for the hearing, and also to share with the American people some of what we were learning so that they were learning with us, rather than just getting a report thrown across the desk at the end of the day. So we'd start with the staff statement, then you'd have a few witnesses on a panel who could then elaborate on that topic, answer questions about it. The staff statement, of course, was very carefully prepared. But the exchanges between the commissioners and the witnesses was not scripted at all. I mean, of course, some commissioners would work hard at preparing their questions according to their likes. And sometimes those were questions that were very interesting. And I think the public found those exchanges illuminating and interesting. But since this is a session with lawyers, it's a little bit of the situation where any trial lawyer worth the salt knows that if you ever learn something at the trial that you hadn't heard of before, you have not prepared for that trial very well. And the same was true for these hearings.
By the way, I forgot to mention to people, if you wish to ask a question, we do have a Q&A function on the Zoom screen, down at the bottom of the Zoom screen. You can type your questions. Aaron Tobin is going to be monitoring those, and we're going to save a few minutes to pick some of the more salient ones to pose from the audience. So you're welcome to do that, and we encourage you to do so. There's so much that we could cover, but we don't have time to do everything. So let's hit some of the highlights of the commission findings itself. If you had any big takeaways from, and I realize there are a lot of big takeaways, but if you had some that you would say in this brief amount of time you wanted to highlight, what would those be from what the commission found?
You know, the usual takeaways people cite are bureaucratic takeaways like, oh, you recommended this reorganization or the creation of that agency. For instance, we were responsible for the creation of an agency called the National Counterterrorism Center, or NCTC, which is not very well known, but has been very effective in the years since then to solve certain problems of fusing information, sharing information. But you know, the big takeaway from the report is actually simply an authoritative foundational understanding of what really happened and why. It's actually hard to exaggerate the significance after a mass trauma of just coming to a reasonably solid shared understanding of what happened in that trauma. And usually if you have a decent understanding of what happened, the story itself just drives so many things that just come out of understanding the story. Just to give you an illustration of what I mean, before our report, a lot of people thought it was really important to concentrate on terrorist finance, to follow the money. The money in this, but when you follow the real story of what happened here, you realize the money was trivial and is not actually very interesting as a way to try to catch terrorists. What was really important when you follow the story was terrorist travel, which is where they have to surface to pass through various gateways before they can go back under the surface again and disappear. And travel documents, all that. So the whole system, as people understood that story, all sorts of ideas then dawned on them about no-fly lists, screening lists of passengers before they even board, changes in the quality of travel documents, and a lot of other things that then join in being yet one more layer in the insight people began to have that a multi-layered defense in which no layer is perfect, but a lot of layers work reasonably well, is actually the way to think about problems like these. Those kinds of realizations and insights and sense of proportion is what comes from actually having a good understanding of the story. So
do you think that if Chairman Kane was correct that the commission was set up to fail, that it did fail, or did it succeed?
No, I think frankly, and here I'm not just speaking for myself, I know that Tom Kane and Lee Hamilton believed the commission was a success. I know that my colleagues on staff are very proud of the work they did on the commission. The commission's findings actually on details of fact have held up really remarkably well now for over 17 years. Just virtually in every detail. There was even a 9/11 review commission Congress created in 2015 to re-examine a few issues, and they found that actually what the commission had found was really right, and that they could not add anything to that. So I think we're all also very proud of the fact, and this is important right now, because this was a success story for American government. We're reading all kinds of headlines right now that are very depressing, frankly, about American government. So it's just useful to recall as you watch all the clips of the tragedy of 9/11 and people pointing fingers about what went wrong, to remember that after that terrible tragedy, the American government put together a little agency that says, we're going to look into this. We're going to find out what happened. We're going to do a very thorough job. We're going to reveal all of that to the American people and share it. We're going to pass legislation that's going to make the country safer, stronger, and wiser. And 20 years later, we have not had a significant Islamist terrorist attack against the United States. By the way, a scenario which people at the time would have thought was at the absolute upper bound of plausible success. So if you kind of take all that and reflect on it, I think you can see why the 9/11 Commission, in a way, is a success story of American government. It's an example of the right thing happening to learn from a terrible trauma and make things better.
Well, let's follow up on one of the comments you made there about something being at the upper bounds of plausibility. Were you saying that the attack itself was at the upper bounds of plausibility or something else?
No, the fact that there has not, if you had asked people in September of 2001, do you think we can go another 20 years without a major Islamist attack upon the United States, successful Islamist attack on the United States, organized from abroad? In September of 2001, people would have said that was almost inconceivable. They couldn't imagine that we could be that successful against the terrorist threat. That's what I mean about if you had asked them to put together a range of plausible scenarios from what would you define as success to what would you define as failure, what's happened in the last 20 years would be at the very upper bound of that definition of success. And that's, the 9/11 Commission isn't alone responsible for that. A lot of other things are, but it made its contribution.
Along those lines, the commission report described the attack itself as being a shock, but not a surprise.
Right.
What did it mean by that?
People in the US government knew some sort of attack was brewing and that was probably coming. We had been hit at embassies in East Africa in '98, nearly a boat bomb, truck bombs, boat bomb attack that almost sank a US destroyer at harbor in Yemen in October of 2000, and then an increasing drumbeat of various kinds of warnings that something was up, some kind of attack was being planned, but no specifics. The general assumption is probably overseas. Various alarms went out during the summer of 2001. So at a strategic level, the United States thought Al-Qaeda was up to something and was planning some sort of attack. The problem is that the United States didn't know where that attack was coming and how it would come. And when the attack materialized, of course, it was just this enormous visceral shock. I think in many ways greater than the shock of Pearl Harbor, because it was so much closer to home and so disproportionate.
And also it was live on TV that people could see and experience in a way that they could not with Pearl Harbor, correct?
Right.
Yeah.
So a terrible shock. And also one of the striking things too is then the shocking realization that that could easily lead to overreactions, because the shock was so awful and the fear was so great that at the time people thought another attack could happen any minute. Going into the 7th floor of the CIA at the Counterterrorism Center, there's a sign up on a door, a huge fold-size sign that says, today is September 10th. It was just, and that was the atmosphere in those months. The CIA threw every single warning they heard about terrorists on the desk of President Bush, almost completely unfiltered. So he had these nerve-jangling briefings every single morning, day in and day out, week in and week out. And then there was the sense that, you know, here we were on Tuesday, September 11th, this beautiful morning. You woke up that morning The notion that the United States would invade Afghanistan on the morning of September 11th was inconceivable, literally inconceivable. It was not even something that had been written up as an option in any of the option papers in the months before 9/11. So on the morning of 9/11, invasion of Afghanistan, inconceivable. By the afternoon of September 11th, it seemed like something that should have been done 6 months ago. Now, take that in, like it seemed obvious that the United States should have gone into Afghanistan. Now take in the realization that that's the way I felt in the morning, that's the way I felt in the afternoon. How do you process that? And in that understanding, I'm afraid, lies a lot of the explanation for why the United States later invaded Iraq, which was unnecessary and turned out to be catastrophically ill-judged. But if you want to understand it, not necessarily to excuse it, but understand it, you've got to understand that the world of the aftermath of September 11th and the way people then began to think about risk.
Let's turn back for a second to how that relates to the recommendations that the commission made for things to protect the country going forward, and recommendations that were accepted and recommendations that perhaps were not accepted. Is there anything that stands out that you say, I wish we could have gotten this to occur?
Easy answer to that is pretty much almost everything we asked the executive branch to do, President Bush did. Almost everything we asked Congress to do, Congress did not do. So what did that mean? What I mean, of course, it's easy to make fun of Congress, but what it was is we're asking congressional committees to give up turf. So, for instance, all these congressional committees have pieces of the turf of the Department of Homeland Security. We said, they ought to give all that up and consolidate. The Department of Homeland Security ought to answer to one committee, not 6 committees in each house. It ought to have one appropriations subcommittee. No, none of the congressional committees would surrender any of that turf that they had dating back from the old pre-department days. The one executive branch recommendation the Bush administration did not take in 2004 was our recommendation that all the interrogation programs of enemy captives should be brought under the law of war and should be appropriately regulated. We didn't know what was going on in those programs back then, but we guessed. And so that's right, the law of war. So they would be treated the way they would be treated under minimum standards that would preclude, quote, cruel, inhumane treatment. And the Bush administration refused at that time to accept those standards and refused to implement that recommendation. They were eventually forced to implement that recommendation 2 years later in 2006, partly from pressure from within by me and Condi Rice, partly from pressure from the Congress led by Senator McCain, and partly by pressure from the courts because of a Supreme Court decision in the summer of '06 that raised the criminal liability for torture. And what was your assessment of the effect that change in interrogation techniques had upon the effectiveness of the information obtained? Oh, actually, our intelligence work against al-Qaeda got better after we made these changes. It had no visible effect on the quality of the intel work on al-Qaeda. And frankly, I kind of, at the time when I was on the inside, I kind of knew that that would be the case. We were running, David, a peculiar natural experiment in which we had one kind of interrogation program that we were using in Iraq against al-Qaeda in Iraq, who were very bad folks. And out of an interrogation center in a place in Iraq called Balad, run by Stan McChrystal, who was then running the Joint Special Operations Command. And I had spent time in Balad and knew General McChrystal. And then we were running another program against al-Qaeda worldwide that had the CIA black sites feature in it. McChrystal and the work in Iraq actually was run under the law of war and was highly effective. and I knew it was effective. The CIA kept insisting that they needed their special program. I think in part because they wanted to defend the fact that they had recommended adopting the program in the first place and had spun up and, in my view, significantly exaggerated its benefits. It turned out, therefore, that when we had kind of an empirical test, because after the program was dissolved, if anything, our intelligence work against al-Qaeda continued to improve in the years following that, as did our general progress in the war against al-Qaeda that culminated in the raid that killed bin Laden in 2011.
Let's change the focus here in the few minutes we have remaining to talk about the lessons learned from the Commission's findings, its investigation, as it affects us today and going forward. When you reflect on it, I just saw in the paper the other day a report from Harvard University's the Kennedy School of Government that estimates nearly 25% of the American population has been born after 9/11.
Right.
So for many of us, it is our Pearl Harbor. It is our JFK assassination. It is a date that we remember because we lived through it. We can say, just as you did, where I was on that date. But for 1/4 of the population, it's a historical event. How do we use what we learned?
Yeah, and that 1/4 includes pretty much all my students at the University of Virginia, who have no personal memory of 9/11. So for them, it's something their parents talk about, the way our parents talked about Pearl Harbor. So now that this has now moved into the world of culture, communication, teaching, education. In a way, it makes the value of having something like the 9/11 Commission report even greater, because more and more now you're conveying that foundational knowledge to a generation that didn't have the benefit of watching all those news stories at the time. And it provides kind of an institutional memory of what happened that's even more valuable as the generations change.
And it sounds to me like, from what you said earlier, it's something that has been validated and not questioned in the way that, for example, the Warren Commission has been demonized for all the things it got wrong rather than all the things it got right. I'm sure there is some demonology out there related to the work of the Commission.
If you wander the far reaches of the
war
internet for a few minutes, you'll find plenty of stuff about 9/11 and the 9/11 Commission, or even about me. But you're right that we do have a much more authoritative account, including, by the way, is a lot of the conspiracy theories have to do with even more exotic theories about why the buildings came down in New York and things like that, on which, by the way, we didn't need to look because the National Institute of Standards and Technology conducted a gigantic series of engineering studies on the various engineering issues involved in the building failures, which is just huge and voluminous. And but that's another basket of issues. The main point, David, is the reason that we did better than the Warren Commission in that respect is because the Commission did a better job of getting the information it needed. The Warren Commission did not get all the information it needed at the time because the government kept some secrets away from them. So to their great credit, Kane and Hamilton, and I, but especially Kane and Hamilton, absolutely insisted that we would see every piece of information that we needed to see to do our job. And they wanted to be able to go out and say publicly and truthfully to the American people that we saw everything that we asked to see, such as, for example, the presidential daily briefs, or information about CIA covert action operations, CIA intelligence gathering, National Security Agency signals intelligence. We had to have access to all of that information, and we had to be able to tell people truthfully that we had seen that, and we were in a position to do that.
here's another one of those postscripts to the commission report and aftermath of 9/11. That is the phrase we continually hear these days, almost like a science fiction novel title, The Forever Wars. Does that have some meaning? Did we need to be there 20 years? Is that something that you could have reflected on from your learnings, what you learned from the commission's work?
Less from the commission's work and more from other work. Including in the commission work, I spent a lot of time in Afghanistan. I spent some time in Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Afghanistan, Pakistan, interviewing a lot of people, going to bin Laden's former headquarters, visiting the refugee camps in Peshawar, which is a total no-go zone for Americans nowadays, I'll tell you. And then was involved some in these issues later on. The war against Al-Qaeda was pretty well over by 2011 in that part of the world. Not 100% over, but it was pretty well done. You can fix a date at what point, what overwatch we needed to have versus the overwatch we needed in other parts of the world that were more neglected, actually like Syria, which was much more dangerous at that time than two eastern provinces in Afghanistan and the northwest frontier province of Pakistan. That was a different war. That was really no longer a war against Al-Qaeda so much. That was American engagement in Afghanistan's civil war. My own view is that the United States should have left, instead of withdrawing 90% of our troops after 2011, we should have, in my view, have withdrawn 100% of our troops. And actually, the Afghan government gave us an open door to do it when the leader at the time, Hamid Karzai, insisted that America was in Afghanistan for its own reasons, and he didn't want to sign a security cooperation agreement under which the United States would remain in Afghanistan. I believe the United States should have taken President Karzai's Afghan nationalist stand at face value and accepted that door, the door he opened, and walked right through it. By the way, he never did sign that agreement, and neither did his successor. I think that was an opportunity to let the Afghans work out their own national destiny on their terms. At a time when the Afghan government had rebuilt itself a little bit after some bad years after 2006 and was in a moderately stable condition in the early 20-teens. But then what we left behind was just enough not to lose, but with a situation that was continually year by year getting worse and worse and worse, in a situation in which every single neighboring country, no exceptions, was hostile to a US presence. So all of our supply lines into Afghanistan had to go through hostile territory, like Pakistan, which was hosting the Taliban. You just see that geopolitically. And then if you compare that, say, to the opportunities to take on Islamist extremists in places like Africa or Syria or the Arabian Peninsula, you can then make judgments about where the United States might most fruitfully put its global energies. But anyway, that's my view of it. But it's not really an issue that the 9/11 Commission took up, because we were really focused on the terrorist danger, and we were not focused on how to wage war against the Taliban for the future of Afghanistan.
Well, I understand that to be true, but here we are just coincidentally at the timing of leaving Afghanistan, looking forward to the future. A question that a lot of people are asking is what is the Afghanistan like today that the Taliban is taking over compared to the Afghanistan they did have 20 years ago when they exited? And are we going to see the Taliban of alleged cooperation, promised cooperation and not tolerance, but more tolerant? Or are we going to see a reenactment of the killing fields of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia?
So a couple of points to just try to leave with your viewers, David. First, from a point of view of human development, much different country, much better off. Now, what do I mean by human development? say you just did an index on just on 3 things: education, electricity, public health. Hugely better off than 20 years ago. Governance and security, not so much. And we never did make a huge investment in trying to solve their governance and security issues until it was too late in some ways for us to fix. Second point, anyone who gives you a confident estimate as to how things are going to turn out in Afghanistan is someone you should not trust. The Taliban themselves don't know how this is going to play out. So how could we possibly know? They're inheriting a country in which the population is desperately tired of war, by and large, and hungry for an end to fighting and for peace. Yet you've got a fraction of the population that has known nothing but war, that is addicted to violence, that has trouble foreseeing an opportunity in the future. So it's a volatile environment in which they're now facing all sorts of issues and dilemmas in governing, with their only guide being that they prefer a society governed more by Islamic law, but where the interpretation of what that means is actually a subject they disagree about quite a lot among themselves. So how this play, and by the way, a situation too in which 3/4 of their economy has been dependent on foreign aid, most of which now is locked up and unavailable to them. So a lot of choices ahead, a lot of difficulties and challenges for Afghanistan. But like for Americans worrying about the Islamic State Khorasan, good news is that that Islamic State's organization and the Taliban are deadly enemies. And so if the United States wants to fight the Islamic State in Afghanistan, it'll have to get in line, because the Taliban wants to fight them and every single neighboring country wants to fight that organization. So the relative role the United States needs to add to that problem is not clear to me.
Well, I see with Aaron Tobin coming on that we are coming up against our timeline. Before I let Aaron ask any particularly salient question that's been posed on the Q&A session, you said one thing earlier, Dr. Zelikow, that the commission's goal was to try to find ways for the United States to be safer, stronger, wiser. Do you think we've accomplished that 20 years after?
The answer is yes. You know, Tom Kane and Lee Hamilton always would get asked this question, is America safe? And the answer they always gave, which was a good answer because they were sensible men, which is we are safer, but not safe. Because if you say we're safe, you feel like then people will become complacent. And then if something happens, you'll be embarrassed and humiliated because someone will run the clip of you saying we were safe. But we are safer and stronger and wiser. We have gotten this danger under control in a proportionate way. These Islamist groups are marginal even inside their own societies. They wanted to act as if they were world historical figures by taking on a superpower. We shouldn't indulge them in treating them as if they were a bigger deal than they were just because they could pull off a big attack 20 years ago. They've been cut down to size and maybe less than that. Can they still do terrible acts of violence in some places? Yes, and actually the worst terrorist attacks of the last 10 years conducted by Islamists were in Paris and Brussels, and they were organized out of Syria, not out of Afghanistan. So good to get these things in perspective and proportion. We are stronger, safer, and wiser, and learning from 9/11, in fact, is something the US government did well.
Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Aaron Tobin. Is there anything you want to pull from the audience that could improve upon that closing line?
I don't think anything could improve upon it. And there were a lot of great questions. I think we probably only have time for one. So to get one question from the audience, there's a question that in your review, in your work during the commission, what's one or maybe a couple of the biggest surprises you ran across in your investigation?
A couple. One was we were surprised at how sloppy the work had been in recounting what had happened on the morning. I talked about that earlier with David, and that was a surprise to us, frankly. We hadn't expected that going in. It's one reminder, as by the way, a lot of lawyers know, how much it repays the effort to do a detailed investigation of the facts rather than kind of what you thought the facts were going in. The second thing is we really learned all kinds of things that surprised us about the policy side of all of this. And about the details of how the US government thought about these problems, what it thought was important, what it didn't think was important. The covert action story was full of revelations and surprises to us. The fact that the US had bin Laden in its gun sights on 4 occasions before 9/11 and for various reasons hadn't pulled the trigger was we mostly didn't know any of those stories and understand anything about any of that because it had all been very secret at the time. So there's just a ton of information, but the fundamental revelation about the whole thing is just the depth of understanding both about the enemy and about us, about both our strengths and our weaknesses as a society, and ways the enemy tried to read and take advantage of our weaknesses, but ways in which we could make our society stronger, frankly, without losing who we were and who we wanted to be in order to live in a free society.
That's very helpful. Dr. Zelikow, thank you so much for doing this today. This was just an outstanding program. David, thank you for your efforts. It's just wonderful programming that we could put on for our membership today. We appreciate you very much, and we are adjourned for the day.
Thank you all.
David.